Daniel Carter never imagined his marriage would end on an ordinary Tuesday morning, but that was exactly the day his life quietly broke apart. The morning began like every other day in the small, peaceful neighborhood outside Seattle where Daniel and his wife Emily had lived for nearly 6 years. The sunlight slipped through the kitchen window while the coffee machine hummed softly on the counter. Daniel stretched his arms and walked downstairs expecting to see Emily sitting at the table with her laptop, like she usually did before work, but the kitchen was empty. At first he didn't think much about it. Emily sometimes left early for meetings at the marketing company where she worked. Daniel poured himself coffee and noticed her mug sitting beside the sink, still half full and cold, which was unusual because Emily never left coffee unfinished. A strange feeling slowly crept into his chest. He turned toward the dining table and that was when he saw the folded piece of paper resting beside the fruit bowl. His name was written on the front in Emily's handwriting. Daniel's heart gave a slow, heavy beat as he picked it up and opened it. The message inside was short, far too short for something that would change his life forever. Emily had written that she was sorry and that she couldn't pretend anymore. She said she needed space to figure out her life and asked him not to try to find her. That was all. No explanation, no long goodbye, just a few quiet lines that suddenly made the house feel empty and unfamiliar. Daniel stood there staring at the note, hoping the words might somehow rearrange themselves into something that made sense, but they didn't. He read it again and again until the letters blurred together. His first thought was that something terrible must have happened, but the more he looked around the house the more he realized this wasn't sudden. Emily's coat was gone from the hallway. Her favorite blue suitcase was missing from the closet. The side of the wardrobe where she kept most of her clothes looked strangely bare. A slow wave of realization moved through him. She hadn't just stepped out for the morning. She had planned this. She had packed her things and walked out of their life while he was asleep upstairs. Daniel sat down heavily in the chair by the table, holding the note in his hand like it might give him answers if he stared long enough. His mind raced through memories from the past few months. Had she seemed distant? Had he missed signs that something was wrong? At first their marriage had felt solid and warm. They had met at a friend's backyard party years ago, and Emily's easy smile had drawn him in instantly. She had been funny, curious, full of energy. They built a quiet life together after the wedding, buying a modest house, decorating the rooms slowly, dreaming about future plans that always seemed just around the corner. Daniel worked as an architect at a growing firm and Emily often talked about expanding her career in marketing. They were not perfect, but Daniel had believed they were strong. Now those memories felt like pages from a different life. Hours passed while Daniel remained at the kitchen table, staring at the empty chair across from him. The silence inside the house felt heavier with every minute. Eventually he forced himself to stand and get ready for work, but the whole day passed in a blur. At the office his coworkers noticed he seemed distracted, but Daniel kept quiet. He wasn't ready to say the words out loud. Saying them would make everything real. When he returned home that evening the house greeted him with the same deep silence. The lights were off, the living room untouched, the air still. Daniel slowly walked from room to room, noticing the small details Emily had taken with her. The framed photo from their trip to Vancouver was gone from the shelf. The scarf she loved to wear in winter was missing from the hook by the door. Even her favorite book from the nightstand had disappeared. It felt like someone had carefully erased her presence piece by piece. The next days were harder than Daniel expected. He woke up early each morning out of habit, only to remember she wasn't there. He checked his phone constantly, hoping to see a message from her explaining everything, but no call ever came. Friends reached out after noticing Emily's social media accounts had gone quiet, but Daniel didn't know what to tell them. He didn't even understand what had happened himself. At night he sat in the living room staring at the wall where their wedding photo used to hang. He remembered the day clearly, the laughter, the music, the promises they made to each other in front of family and friends. Back then Emily had looked at him with bright eyes that seemed certain about their future. Daniel wondered when that certainty had disappeared. A week passed, then another. Life outside continued as normal while Daniel struggled to move forward. The house felt too big and too quiet for one person. Sometimes he caught himself listening for the sound of Emily's footsteps upstairs or the soft music she used to play while cooking dinner. But the sounds never came. One rainy afternoon, almost a month after she left, Daniel returned home from work earlier than usual. Gray clouds hung low in the sky and the neighborhood streets looked empty and wet. He had barely taken off his jacket when the doorbell rang. The sudden sound surprised him because he wasn't expecting anyone. For a moment he considered ignoring it, but the bell rang again. Daniel walked slowly to the door and opened it. The sight in front of him made him stop in complete surprise. Standing on the porch was Margaret Bennett, Emily's mother. Margaret was a tall woman with calm eyes and silver hair tied neatly behind her head. Daniel had always respected her, but they had never spent much time together outside family gatherings. She held a small suitcase and looked slightly tired from traveling. "Hello, Daniel," she said gently. Daniel blinked, still confused. "Margaret. I didn't know you were coming." She gave a quiet smile that carried a hint of sadness. "I didn't plan to visit," she replied softly. "But I think we need to talk." Daniel stepped aside and let her enter the house. Margaret slowly walked into the living room and glanced around, noticing the empty shelves and the quiet air. She seemed to understand immediately what had happened. After a moment she turned back toward him. "Emily left, didn't she?" she asked. Daniel nodded slowly. Margaret placed her suitcase near the door and sat at the kitchen table, the same place where Daniel had first read Emily's note weeks earlier. The rain outside tapped gently against the windows while silence filled the room. Daniel didn't know why she had come, but something in her expression told him this visit carried answers he hadn't been able to find alone. Finally Margaret looked up at him and spoke in a calm voice that held both honesty and regret. "Daniel," she said, "there are things about Emily that you deserve to know." Daniel felt his chest tighten as he sat across from her. His marriage had already collapsed in front of him, but he sensed that what Margaret was about to reveal might change the story of those last months in ways he never expected. And in that quiet kitchen, with rain falling outside and the truth slowly rising between them, Daniel realized that Emily's sudden departure was only the beginning of a much deeper story. Daniel sat across from Margaret at the kitchen table, still holding Emily's note in his hand as if it might suddenly explain everything, but Margaret's serious expression told him the truth would come from her instead. Rain tapped steadily against the windows while the quiet house felt heavier than before. Margaret looked around the kitchen slowly, noticing the empty chair where Emily used to sit and the silence that had replaced the life once inside the home. Then she folded her hands together and spoke in a calm but honest voice. She told Daniel that Emily had not been fully truthful with him during the last year of their marriage, and the reason she left was more complicated than the short message she had written. Daniel felt a tight knot form in his chest as he listened. Margaret explained that Emily had been seeing another man for almost a year before she walked out. At first Emily had told her it was only a friendship from work, someone she talked to during stressful days, but over time Margaret began to realize the situation was deeper than that. Emily started visiting less often, avoiding conversations about her marriage, and speaking about a new direction in life. Daniel stared at the table, shocked by how calmly Margaret spoke the words that shattered the last piece of hope he had been holding on to. He asked who the man was, but Margaret shook her head and said the identity didn't matter anymore because the real problem was the choices Emily had made and the lies that followed. Daniel leaned back in his chair, trying to process the idea that the woman he loved had been living a second life right beside him for months. He remembered evenings when Emily stayed late at work, weekends when she seemed distant, and small moments he once ignored because he trusted her completely. Now those memories looked different, like puzzle pieces suddenly forming a painful picture. Margaret's voice softened as she explained that Emily believed leaving quietly would be easier than facing the truth and admitting what she had done. Daniel gave a tired laugh that held more sadness than anger, saying it might have been easier for Emily, but it left him standing in the ruins of a life he thought was real. Margaret did not defend her daughter. Instead, she admitted that she had tried to talk to Emily many times, warning her that running from problems rarely leads to happiness. But Emily had convinced herself that she deserved a different future, one that felt exciting and new, and she refused to listen. The room grew quiet again while Daniel tried to control the storm of emotions inside him. Anger came first, then disappointment, but underneath both feelings was a deep sense of loss for the marriage he believed in. Margaret noticed the struggle on his face and spoke gently, reminding him that none of this was his fault. She said she had watched their relationship for years and always believed Daniel had treated Emily with patience and respect. Hearing those words gave Daniel a strange mix of comfort and sadness. For weeks he had been asking himself what mistake he made, wondering if he had somehow pushed Emily away without realizing it. Margaret assured him that sometimes people walk away not because something is broken, but because they keep searching for something they cannot clearly define. After a long pause, she asked if Emily had contacted him since leaving. Daniel shook his head and said there had been no calls, no messages, nothing except the short note she left behind. Margaret sighed quietly, as if the answer confirmed what she already suspected. She told Daniel that Emily had always struggled with decisions, often chasing feelings instead of thinking about the long-term consequences. Daniel listened silently, realizing there were parts of Emily's personality he never fully understood. As the afternoon slowly turned into evening, the rain outside softened and the tension in the room eased slightly. Margaret eventually stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the gray sky. She said she had come not only to explain the truth but also to check on Daniel because she knew the situation must have been painful. Daniel admitted the last few weeks had been lonely and confusing, and hearing the full story, even though it hurt, helped him finally understand what happened. Margaret turned back toward him and offered a gentle smile, saying that truth often arrives late but it still has the power to clear the fog around a broken situation. Daniel felt something inside him shift as he realized he was no longer waiting for answers. The answers were already sitting across from him. Later that evening he offered Margaret the guest room for the night since she had traveled far to visit. At first she refused politely, saying she didn't want to cause inconvenience, but Daniel insisted that the house had more than enough space and it would be good to have someone there for a few days. Margaret accepted with a thankful nod and carried her suitcase upstairs. That night Daniel noticed the house felt slightly less empty knowing another person was there. The next morning the smell of coffee drifted from the kitchen before he even woke up. When he walked downstairs he saw Margaret standing by the stove preparing breakfast as if she had lived there for years. The simple scene felt strangely comforting, something Daniel hadn't experienced since Emily left. Over the next few days Margaret stayed in the house while she visited the town and took time to rest from her trip. During quiet evenings they talked about many things: family memories, life lessons, and the complicated ways people sometimes hurt each other without fully understanding why. Daniel discovered a side of Margaret he had never seen before. She had a calm wisdom and a quiet strength that made conversations feel easy. Instead of dwelling on anger or blame, she focused on helping Daniel look forward. One evening they sat together on the back porch watching the sunset spread warm colors across the sky. Margaret spoke softly about how life rarely follows the straight path people imagine in their younger years. Daniel admitted he felt lost after everything that happened, unsure what direction his future would take now that his marriage had ended so suddenly. Margaret listened carefully and told him that difficult endings often create unexpected beginnings, even if people cannot see them right away. Daniel smiled slightly at the thought, though he wasn't ready to believe it fully yet. Still, Margaret's presence slowly brought calm back into his daily routine. The house felt warmer with conversations and shared meals, and Daniel noticed he was sleeping better for the first time in weeks. What started as a short visit began turning into something more meaningful, though neither of them talked about it directly. In those quiet days Daniel realized Margaret had not come just to deliver painful news about Emily. She had come to bring honesty, support, and a sense of peace back into a home that had been filled with confusion. And while Daniel still carried the scars of Emily's betrayal, he also felt a quiet strength growing inside him, a feeling that perhaps the story of his life was not ending after all but slowly turning toward a path he never expected to walk. Time moved quietly after Margaret's visit began, and what Daniel first believed would be a short stay slowly turned into something longer and more meaningful. Days blended into weeks, and the empty house that once echoed with silence slowly regained warmth. Each morning Daniel woke to the soft sound of dishes in the kitchen or the smell of fresh coffee drifting through the hallway. Margaret moved around the house with calm energy, never acting like a guest but never overstepping either. She simply brought life back into the rooms that had felt frozen since Emily left. Daniel noticed the change in himself too. At work he began focusing again, finishing projects that had been left half done during the painful weeks after Emily's departure. His co-workers saw the difference in his mood, though he didn't explain the full story to anyone. When he returned home each evening, the house no longer felt like a place he was forced to face alone. Margaret would often be in the kitchen preparing dinner or reading by the living room window. Their conversations started small at first, simple things about the day or the town, but gradually they grew deeper. They talked about travel, about books, about the strange turns life sometimes takes when people least expect it. Daniel discovered that Margaret had once worked as a teacher for many years before retiring. She spoke about her students with warmth and humor, remembering their personalities and the lessons they taught her in return. Listening to her stories made Daniel realize how thoughtful and observant she was. One evening he came home to find soft music playing while Margaret arranged fresh flowers in a small glass vase on the dining table. The sight made him smile because the simple detail made the house feel alive again. He joked that she was slowly redesigning the place, and Margaret laughed, saying every home deserves a little care and color. That night they ate dinner together and talked longer than usual. Daniel admitted that the first weeks after Emily left had been the hardest time of his life. Margaret listened without interrupting, her calm presence making it easier for him to speak honestly. She told him she admired the way he handled the situation with dignity instead of anger. Daniel shrugged and said anger would not change the past, though sometimes the hurt still surprised him when he thought about it too long. Margaret understood that feeling better than he expected. She explained that watching Emily make careless decisions had been painful for her as well, because every parent hopes their child will treat others with kindness and responsibility. The honesty in her voice created a quiet understanding between them. As autumn deepened outside, the two of them began taking evening walks around the neighborhood. The air carried the cool scent of falling leaves, and the sidewalks were often covered with golden colors from the trees. During those walks they spoke about the future more often than the past. Margaret encouraged Daniel to keep believing in the possibility of happiness, even if his marriage had ended in disappointment. Daniel admitted he was not sure he would trust love again easily, but he still believed life had more chapters waiting ahead. One weekend they visited a park near the lake at the edge of town. Families walked along the trails, children played near the water, and the peaceful atmosphere made the afternoon feel lighter than usual. Daniel and Margaret found a bench overlooking the lake and sat quietly watching the reflections of clouds moving across the surface. After a few minutes, Margaret asked a simple question that caught Daniel off guard. She wondered if he regretted marrying Emily. Daniel thought carefully before answering because he wanted to be honest with himself. He said he did not regret loving her because love itself had never been the mistake. What hurt was how the relationship ended, not the years they shared while it was real. Margaret nodded thoughtfully, saying that answer showed the kind of character Daniel carried inside. She believed many people would have allowed bitterness to replace their kindness, but Daniel had chosen to remain thoughtful even while healing from betrayal. The conversation continued as the sun began lowering toward the horizon. Daniel asked Margaret why she decided to stay longer than planned instead of returning home immediately after telling him the truth about Emily. Margaret smiled softly and admitted that at first she only intended to visit for a day or two. But once she arrived, she realized Daniel was carrying a heavy loneliness, and she didn't want to leave him alone with that weight so quickly. Daniel thanked her sincerely because her presence had helped more than she probably understood. Over time their bond grew naturally, without either of them forcing it or even naming it clearly. They simply enjoyed each other's company. Some evenings they played board games at the kitchen table, laughing at small mistakes and joking about who was winning. Other nights they watched old movies while sharing stories about different moments from their lives. Daniel noticed how easy it felt to talk with Margaret about subjects he rarely discussed with anyone else. She had a calm wisdom that made every conversation feel meaningful. Margaret also noticed changes in Daniel. The sadness that once clouded his eyes was slowly fading, replaced by a steady confidence. He began making small improvements around the house again, fixing things he had ignored during the painful weeks earlier in the year. Margaret often teased him about becoming a full-time handyman, and Daniel laughed in return, saying the house deserved some attention after everything it had witnessed. One evening during a walk near the lake, Margaret paused beside the water and said life has a strange way of opening unexpected doors when people believe everything is finished. Daniel asked what she meant, and she explained that sometimes difficult endings guide people toward connections they never imagined possible. Daniel listened carefully but did not immediately respond. Instead, he looked across the quiet water reflecting the evening sky and considered her words. There was something peaceful about the moment, something that felt like the calm after a long storm. Neither of them spoke for a while, yet the silence between them felt comfortable instead of awkward. Eventually Margaret suggested they head back home before it became too dark. As they walked along the path, Daniel realized how much his world had changed in just a few months. When Emily left, he believed his life had collapsed completely. But now he saw that even painful moments could lead to unexpected strength and companionship. What Daniel did not know was that far away, Emily had begun facing the consequences of the choices she made. The exciting new life she chased had not turned out the way she imagined. Regret had slowly replaced excitement, and the memory of the home she left behind began pulling her thoughts back toward Daniel. While Daniel and Margaret continued their quiet routine, unaware of the coming change, Emily started planning a trip back to the town she once called home. And soon, the peaceful balance Daniel had built would be tested by the return of the person who first broke his heart. Months had passed since Emily walked out, and Daniel had begun to find a quiet rhythm to life that felt steady for the first time in weeks. The house, once painfully empty, now held warmth again with Margaret's presence. She had settled into a comfortable routine, helping around the home, sharing meals, and bringing a sense of life back to the rooms that had felt cold and silent. Daniel noticed the difference in himself too. His thoughts were no longer consumed by confusion and heartbreak. He worked with focus at the architecture firm, completed long overdue projects, and even started enjoying small moments of solitude without dread. Their evenings together became a routine he valued, full of conversation, laughter, and quiet companionship. They often cooked together, shared books, and occasionally went for walks, enjoying the crisp autumn air and the feeling of peace he hadn't felt in months. But just as Daniel started believing that life could move forward, a Saturday morning changed everything. He was fixing a loose board on the porch when he noticed a car pulling into the driveway. He wiped his hands and looked up, and his heart stopped. Emily was standing there, her suitcase at her side, looking uncertain, nervous, as if she weren't sure she belonged in this place anymore. Daniel froze, unsure whether to step forward or stay still, his emotions twisting inside him. Emily called his name softly, and he approached her slowly, every step measured, every memory of the past months flooding back. She apologized for showing up unannounced and said she needed to see him because she realized the mistake she had made. Daniel remained calm on the outside but felt a swirl of emotions inside, resentment, sadness, and a strange sense of closure he hadn't yet understood. Emily explained that the relationship she had pursued after leaving him had failed, and she wanted to come back, hoping he could forgive her. Daniel studied her face carefully, noticing the same nervous expressions he remembered from the day she left, yet also the vulnerability she now carried. Before he could respond, the door behind him opened, and Margaret appeared, calm and composed. Emily froze when she saw her mother, confusion and surprise crossing her features. Margaret asked Emily calmly why she was there and reminded her that Daniel's life had continued while she was away. Emily's eyes darted between them, realizing in that moment that the bond Daniel shared with her mother had grown during her absence. She realized too late that the comfort and understanding she had disrupted had become something steady and reliable in his life. Daniel's face remained composed, and he told Emily gently that the house stopped being her home the moment she walked away. Emily's eyes filled with regret as she admitted she had hurt him deeply. Daniel nodded and said that yes, she had hurt him, but the months he had spent rebuilding, healing, and learning from the pain had shown him that life could continue without her. Margaret stood quietly beside him, her calm presence reinforcing the reality that things had changed. Daniel felt a quiet strength within himself, a certainty that had not been there when Emily left. He realized that the lessons he had learned, the support he had received from Margaret, and the peace he had begun to find in his own company were more valuable than reopening the wounds of the past. Emily, standing there with her suitcase, finally understood that her absence had not only left Daniel to suffer but had also created an unexpected bond between him and her mother. Words failed her as she recognized that Daniel's life had evolved beyond the grief she had left behind. Daniel looked at Margaret briefly, their eyes meeting with a silent acknowledgement of the shared journey they had undertaken together. The afternoon sunlight warmed the yard, and the quiet wind moved softly through the trees as Daniel turned back to Emily one last time. He spoke with sincerity, wishing her well and hoping she could find what she was looking for, but making it clear that there was no longer space in his heart for what had been lost. Emily, understanding the finality in his voice, picked up her suitcase and walked away slowly, the sound of her footsteps fading down the driveway until she disappeared from view. Daniel stood on the porch for a moment, feeling the emptiness she had left behind, but it was different this time, lighter, no longer heavy with confusion or longing. He turned to Margaret, who smiled gently, and realized that in the months since Emily had gone, he had discovered a connection, comfort, and understanding he had never expected. That quiet afternoon, standing together in the sunlight, Daniel understood that life had given him a second chance, not with the woman who left, but with someone who had helped him heal, someone who had shown him that the heart could grow stronger even after betrayal. Margaret's presence was no longer simply that of a guest, she had become a part of the life he was ready to embrace. Daniel realized that pain had not ended his story but had redirected it towards something new, something filled with respect, care, and the possibility of a deep connection built on trust and shared understanding. As they walked back inside together, the house no longer felt like a place of loss. It felt like the beginning of a new chapter, one where love could exist in unexpected forms, where life could continue after heartbreak, and where hope had quietly returned to fill the spaces that had once felt empty. The past with Emily had shaped him, but it no longer defined him. Standing there with Margaret by his side, Daniel finally felt the sense of peace and promise that had eluded him for so long, ready to step forward into a future that was no longer shadowed by regret but illuminated by the warmth of understanding, companionship, and the quiet beginning of something new.